Hi, my name's Cheese, and welcome to another Bonesweeper progress update video. If you haven't heard of the project before, you can check out this other video for an overview, but the TLDR is, it's Minesweeper, but you're digging up fossils, and you get to build skeletons out of the stuff you find. For the past month or so, my progress has been divided between Bonesweeper and some other projects that have had birthdays to celebrate, so after the usual recap, we'll take a look at how this project has progressed over the past year or so. Peter has been working on a new music track for the dig phase, which I'm really enjoying. We're feeling like it would be a good fit for cold or snow environments, and I'm looking forward to refactoring dig music to be biome specific so that biomes can feel a little more distinct and the music can establish and hold its identity better. Continuing on with the museum focus work I'd done last month, I added a placeholder inspect camera to the museum, which finally makes it possible to zoom in and check out misc fossils and their contents. Longer term, misc fossils will go in display cabinets and have a viewing interface that's more like the prototype's showcase. I put together a new Blender add-on to automatically export metadata for floor layouts and door positions, and made a few additional placeholder rooms to bring some variety to the temp museum. I refactored a bunch of code to consolidate interactions with museum entities into one common API for interacting, picking up, and putting items down. I also wrapped up my map experiments and integrated that with the game. Presentation is still temporary, but the museum map can now be used for fast travel to distant rooms or to access edit mode that gives a blueprint view where new rooms can be added. Eventually new rooms will be unlocked via the research screen. For now, there's an add button that just gives a random room that can be placed. With the map now functional, I feel like the game is finally in a state where it can convey the idea that the museum will grow to meet players' storage needs as they play. There's still a lot of work to do and polish to add, but the museum now feels functional enough that when I switch over to adding more content, it'll be able to scale. Development began with roughing out the map phase first, because it acts as a hub for the rest of the game, and is something that communicates how the full game will be different from the prototype. The map phase also contained what were probably the biggest workflow unknowns. I only did one continent to start with because that was enough for me to get the time slider functional and know that I had a workflow capable of producing the results I wanted. Today, the map phase is probably the most polished out of any of the gameplay phases. The background is nice and busy and gains doodads and mementos as the player spends more time in-game. Travel lines convey some fun animations that help hide, but also convey loading progress. Mocking up the museum was something else that I prioritized early on to help give a sense of direction for the game when discussing how it would compare with the prototype. The mock-up was very bare bones, repurposing skeletons and models from the prototype, along with a couple of quickly scribbled textures to recreate a little concept sketch that I'd done shortly after wrapping up the prototype. Unlike the map phase, I didn't adapt and integrate my initial experiments into the game, and instead made a little generated space for early builds, which just laid out the player's specimens in rows by species. Today, what I initially created as the temp museum has most of what the final version will need, and I'm getting close to migrating it across to a more solid implementation. Players can walk around, place their skeletons and misc fossils, interact with them, add more rooms to their museum, and use doors to traverse between them. There's also a map for fast travel, which switches to look like blueprints when editing the layout of the museum's rooms. Once the map phase was functional and the museum mock-up was done enough to show what it was meant to be, I gave attention to the dig phase, starting with experiments exploring different approaches for variation in tile striation. A feature I really enjoy is that when digging exposes more than one tile, there's a tiny delay added based on distance, making it feel like dug tiles cascade outward from an epicenter. Today, the dig phase is mostly gameplay complete. In addition to regular dig sites of varying size and difficulty, there are also rare, full specimen dig sites that contain one, and only one, of a skeleton's fossils, which are treated as unique skeletons that fossils from other dig sites cannot be used in. It creates a different sense of risk and reward and invites players to play without making mistakes. To get extra mileage out of each skeleton in the full version, I wanted to have multiple poses for each species that reused the same skeleton model and armature. Knowing that different poses would need different chunks in order to be visibly readable, I decided that instead of having one chunk be a single mesh, each individual fossil bone should be a separate mesh, and its skeleton chunk should be defined as a group of those, which is a bit more complicated than how I'd done things in the prototype. Another aspect I worked on early was an alternate gameplay mode that allowed players to manually pick up and move chunks around like jigsaw puzzle pieces as a less stressful option for players who don't enjoy the default real-time gameplay of the assembly phase. Today, the assembly phase asks the player which gameplay mode they'd like the first time they play, handles misc fossils, even if there's only one type and they've all got ants in them, puts tiny skeletons on a table for up-close assembly, and presents a cool warehouse environment that can scale from the itty-bitty to the gargantuan. The main missing piece at the moment is the research phase, where players will be able to spend surplus fossils to unlock museum displays and fixtures. This aspect will probably be the part of the game that will require the most balancing and playtesting, but none of that will really be useful until the game is closer to release. I haven't yet settled on what the final look and feel for fossils and misc fossils will be. My intention at the moment is to move away from the hard, faceted, low poly feel of the prototype towards something smooth shaded and textured. I have a little uncertainty on the specifics of how I'm going to handle character customization. I like the idea of allowing players to use a colour picker for skin tones, and swapping in and out meshes for different clothing. The thing I'm unsure of is whether or not I'll be able to get meshes to line up without seams or shading anomalies, something I've struggled to do with Godot in the past. The map phase's current continent is a placeholder, and at this stage I'm intending to place it with something that is a little more cute and less detailed, and of course I need to make the rest of the continents and animate them. There's some UI work, avatar behaviours, and maybe some more doodads to add as well. Dig phase backgrounds are still very temporary, and as a part of reworking them, I'd also like to experiment with ways of breaking up the dig site's straight side edges to make them feel a little more organic. The dig phase needs some particle effects and animations for markers too. There's also a second type of rare dig site that I'm planning to implement that allows players to find unique and exciting specimens that don't need assembly but will be destroyed if any mistakes are made. The assembly phase still needs a sequence for revealing the contents of sorted misc fossils, and there are some tweaks I want to make to allow skeletons of the same species to vary in size for more variety. I also need to do some more work on making the placement silhouettes more readable. The museum's character controller needs a little polish, and there's still a bunch of UX work for interacting with things that I need to get around to addressing after I've added display cases and skeleton mounts. There's a lot of asset creation work I need to do for museum displays, furniture, fixtures, and so forth. I also plan to expose some more customization options for lighting and wall or floor texturing. Currently the museum phase also lacks blind-friendly gameplay. Last but not least, I need to finalize the game's list of skeletons and misc fossils and actually make them. I'll need to do some extra research and writing for museum displays, which I intend to use to reference real-world research papers similar to Hive Time's BFACTS. There's still plenty of work ahead of me before Bonesweeper is done, but with the exception of the research phase and rare unique specimens, all aspects of the game are in and functional to some degree. I'd like to be further ahead of course, but all in all I think the game is shaping up well and I'm looking forward to continuing to work on the game in the new year. A very big thank you to the supporters going by on screen at the moment. Their support has helped me eat while making this game and I am so very appreciative. Special thanks to new supporter Frank W. A huge thanks also to Screen Tasmania, who supported this project with a small grant at the end of last year. Anyway, that's about it for today. I hope the reflections have been interesting. If you'd like to keep track of development or try the playable prototype, you can find some links in the description. And if you're super keen to try out what we've talked about here today, I make early test builds available to my Patreon supporters. Thanks for watching, and goodbye!